The town's festering secret sat in Sheriff Blackwood's last cell, locked away in the form of a girl who looked more like a ghost than a killer. All Sheriff Jedediah Blackwood wanted was to see her hang by morning and wash his hands of the whole damn thing. The law was the law. But when he held the lantern up for one last look, he saw it. Not the defiance of a murderer, but the unmistakable cattle brand of the Honorable Judge Thorne, seared into the soft flesh just above her hip. The law was clear. She had taken a life and had to swing for it. But the brand told a story no court in the territory would ever hear, a story of ownership and abuse that screamed for a different kind of justice. The town demanded a body on the gallows, but looking at that mark, Jedediah knew this wasn't about the law anymore. This was about making something wrong, right? And true justice, he realized as his hand went to his buckle, would not be delivered from the end of a rope. The sun bled out across the hard-pan streets of Redemption, painting the dust in shades of bruised purple and tired gold. For Sheriff Jedediah Blackwood, it was just another day bleeding into the next, each one a meticulous, lonely ritual of locking doors and checking ledgers. His office was a fortress of order in a world that always tilted toward chaos. The pot-bellied stove was cold, the coffee was bitter, and the silence was a constant companion, thick and heavy as a winter blanket. He moved with the quiet competence of a man who had made peace with being alone, his routine a shield against the memories that haunted the edges of the quiet hours. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath. The summer had been long and dry, a drought of the spirit as much as of the land. Commerce had slowed to a trickle, the flow of goods and goodwill choked off by the ever-tightening grip of Judge Thaddeus Thorne. People walked with their heads down, their conversations clipped and wary, as if the very air belonged to the judge. Before his final patrol, Jedediah paused, his hand hesitating over the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk. He unlocked it, the click of the tumbler unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, lay a small silver locket. He didn't open it. He never did. Just looking at its tarnished surface was enough to bring the cold ghost of failure back into the room. It was a perfect, palm-sized reminder of a past where his rigid faith in the rules had cost him everything. He locked the drawer, the sound of final metallic punctuation mark on another day, spent serving the law that had failed to protect his own. The discovery of the brand changed the very texture of the air in the cell. It was no longer a simple holding pen for a condemned killer. It was a cage holding a terrible secret. The brand the judge's signature of ownership was a declaration of war against everything Jedediah believed the law should be. His mind, usually a calm and orderly place, was a maelstrom of shock and dawning fury. The choice was a razor's edge: uphold his sworn duty and let this horrific injustice proceed, or betray his badge to honor a deeper, truer law. He made his choice. Striding back to his office, his boots echoing with newfound purpose, he took a piece of official stationery from his desk. His hand was steady as he dipped the pen in the inkwell. He wrote with the cold, precise language of the law he was about to subvert, citing a forgotten territorial statute regarding the proper notification of next of kin, a minor, almost laughable technicality. He declared a 24-hour stay of execution. He walked back out into the night and nailed the handwritten order to his own office door, the hammer blows like gunshots in the quiet town square. It was a flimsy shield, a weapon made of paper and ink, but it was the first shot fired. Word of the stay moved through Redemption like a grass fire. It was a small thing, a delay, but it was the first time in a decade anyone had seen an official act that didn't seem to originate from the judge's own pen. In the morning, a current of nervous energy crackled through the town. At the general store, conversations would start, then die out as soon as one of the judge's men walked in. But the seeds of defiance were sown. At the blacksmith's forge, Elias Vance, a man as solid and unbending as the iron he worked, paused in his hammering. He looked across the square at the piece of paper on the sheriff's door, his expression thoughtful, a flicker of something that might have been hope in his weary eyes. The town, for the first time in a long time, was watching. They were terrified, but they were watching. The midday sun beat down on the sheriff's office, but the chill inside had nothing to do with the temperature. Judge Thaddeus Thorne arrived not with deputies, but with the suffocating weight of his own reputation. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on, his fine wool coat a stark contrast to the dusty, practical world of redemption. He filled Jedediah's small office, his presence shrinking the room, his voice a smooth, cultured balm that felt more dangerous than a drawn pistol. He spoke of duty and unpleasant necessities, his words dripping with a paternal concern that was a poorly veiled threat. "A sheriff's strength, Jedediah," the judge said, placing a heavy manicured hand on his shoulder, "is in seeing the bigger picture, in understanding that the health of the community sometimes requires difficult sacrifices." Jedediah could feel the pressure of that hand, a physical manifestation of the judge's influence, and he fought the urge to shrug it off. Thorne then requested a pastoral visit with Elara to offer her a final peace. It was a reasonable request, a Christian kindness. To refuse would be to show his hand. Jedediah, still clinging to the hope that he could navigate this within the bounds of the system, reluctantly agreed. He watched the judge walk toward the cells, a shepherd going to his flock. An hour later, Jedediah returned with a tin plate of food for the prisoner. He found Elara huddled in the corner of her cell, not just beaten, but diminished. A fresh, dark bruise bloomed across her cheekbone, a ugly purple flower of violence. The message was stark, brutal, and clear. The system would not protect her. The law was not her shield. It was the judge's cage. The judge's visit was a private warning. His next move was a public spectacle of power. He walked into the general store, the hub of the town's nervous energy, and with a magnanimous wave of his hand, forgave the debts of 3 prominent families who had been struggling under his thumb. It was a masterstroke of public relations, reinforcing his image as a firm but benevolent leader. The recipients of his charity were effusively grateful, their relief palpable. The rest of the town saw the performance for what it was, a demonstration of his power to both give and take away. The very same afternoon, Elias Vance, the blacksmith who had watched the sheriff's office with a glimmer of hope, found himself a pariah. When he went to the bank for his weekly line of credit to buy coal, the manager, a man he'd known for 20 years, refused to even look him in the eye. The credit was revoked, no reason given, none was needed. The town saw the warning clearly. They saw the reward for loyalty and the swift, silent punishment for even the hint of defiance. The pall of fear that had momentarily lifted settled back over redemption, heavier and colder than before. Jedediah stood in the semi-darkness of the jail, the smell of dust and despair thick in the air. He stared at Elara, at the ugly bruise that marred the pale canvas of her cheek. It was more than an injury. It was a symbol, a stark, physical manifestation of his own failure. He had followed the rules, he had trusted the process, and this was the result. The law hadn't protected her, it had held her still while the monster struck. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of his world came crashing down. His faith in the system, his belief in the sanctity of procedure. It was all a lie. A comforting fiction he had told himself to make sense of a world that had taken his wife and was now about to take this girl. He was confronting his blind self, the naive idealist who believed the law was a separate entity from the corrupt men who wielded it. The law wasn't a shield. It was the judge's weapon, and in that instant, his goal fundamentally changed. This was no longer about finding the truth within the system. It was about becoming justice outside of it. He looked at Elara, then at the heavy iron ring of jail keys hanging on the wall, the ultimate symbol of his legal authority. He took them down, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. They felt different now. They were no longer the keys to a cage. They were the keys to a reckoning. As if in response to his silent decision, a quiet knock came at the office door. It was Doc Miller, the town physician, a man of few words and profound integrity. He carried his worn leather bag, his eyes meeting Jedediah's with a look of quiet understanding. He didn't ask for permission, he simply walked to the cell. Jedediah watched as the doctor gently cleaned the cut on Elara's lip, his movements calm and professional. He said nothing of the judge, nothing of the town's fear. He spoke only to Elara, his voice a low, soothing murmur about the healing properties of the salve he was applying. His presence was a silent act of defiance, a clear sign of a shifting allegiance in a town where such things could cost a man everything. When he was done, he packed his bag, but as he stood to leave, he quietly placed a small, canvas-wrapped bundle on Jedediah's desk. He met the sheriff's gaze one last time, a flicker of solidarity in his tired eyes, and then he was gone. Jedediah opened the bundle. Inside was a small bottle of laudanum, clean bandages, and a sharp, sterile-looking scalpel. It was a silent offer of aid for the journey to come, a testament that even in a town choked by fear, decency had not been entirely extinguished. The breakout was a disaster. Jedediah had planned it with the meticulous precision of a lawman, charting a course through the back alleys and gullies that he knew better than anyone. But the judge, a master strategist of a different sort, had anticipated him. It wasn't the main roads that were watched, it was the hidden paths, the escape routes only a local would know. They were cornered within an hour, a posse of the judge's deputies closing in, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. They were forced off the path and into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Badlands, a labyrinth of rock and shadow where the judge's men wouldn't follow, but where survival was a question of hours, not days. Elara, weak from her ordeal, stumbled. Jedediah, his heart pounding with a cold, rising panic, knew they had only one hope, a single, desperate gamble. He had to find Silas. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Silas was a half-mad prospector, a recluse who lived in the rocks like a coyote, a man Jedediah himself had arrested years ago for claim jumping. It had been a clean arrest by the book, but it had cost Silas everything. Now, the sheriff, the pillar of the law, would have to go to the man he had condemned and beg for help, a humiliation that cut deeper than any bullet. The judge's response was swift and brutal. By morning, the entire county knew that Sheriff Blackwood was a fugitive, an outlaw who had broken his sacred oath and absconded with a convicted killer. A massive bounty was placed on his head, the paper notices plastered over every available surface in town. The tattered bounty poster with Jedediah's face, grim and determined, was nailed to the town's message board right over a faded year-old missing poster for another young woman who had vanished without a trace. The visual parallel was a chilling, unspoken threat. The town, which had dared to hope for a brief moment, now capitulated completely. Seeing their hero fail, seeing the full, unrestrained wrath of the judge unleashed, they retreated into a prison of fear. The blacksmith, Elias Vance, was arrested on trumped-up charges of aiding a fugitive, his forge falling silent for the first time in 30 years. The windows of every house were shuttered, the streets empty. Redemption was no longer a town, it was a cage, and everyone knew who held the key. Silas's shack was less a home than a scar on the landscape, a collapsed lean-to of scrap timber and rusted tin clinging to the side of a rocky outcrop. The old prospector's price for sanctuary was Jedediah's pride. He forced the sheriff to speak the words, to admit that the law he'd upheld had been a flawed and fragile thing. Only then, after the confession was scraped raw from Jedediah's throat, did Silas offer them water and a place out of the punishing sun. He led them not to a hidden cave or a secret path, but back toward the civilized world, to a place Jedediah would never have found on his own, an abandoned line shack, half swallowed by the prairie, that the judge used as his personal prison. The air inside was thick with the ghosts of past cruelties. It was here, in this forgotten place, that Silas pried up a loose floorboard, revealing a small, hidden compartment, and inside lay the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't gold or a weapon. It was a fine leather-bound book. Elara, who had been a silent, haunted presence throughout their flight, finally spoke. In the relative safety of the shack, the dam of her trauma finally broke. She revealed her hidden self, the full, horrific story of her captivity, of the other girls who had come before her, and of the violent act of self-defense that the judge had twisted into a cold-blooded murder. Back in Redemption, the news of the blacksmith's arrest had smothered the last embers of hope. But Doc Miller, hearing of Elias's plight, decided that silence was no longer a virtue. He moved quietly through the town, not with a rifle, but with a quiet, steady resolve. He visited the stable owner, the preacher, and a handful of other townsfolk who still had a spine. They were not fighters, but they were decent men. He didn't ask them to raise arms. He asked them for something far more subtle, a diversion. A plan was hatched, a simple, chaotic act designed to pull the judge's hired guns away from the town square at the crucial moment, a small act of collective courage to show that the spirit of the community was not entirely broken. The anchor of their conspiracy was the judge's secret ledger. Jedediah opened the book, its fine leather a grotesque contrast to the horrors detailed within. It was a cold, meticulous record of his crimes, a list of women's names, dates of acquisition, and prices paid or debts forgiven. It was a weapon of pure, undeniable truth, and with it, Jedediah finally had a plan, not just to survive, but to cleanse the town of its sickness. They rode into redemption as the sun climbed the eastern sky, the morning of the rescheduled execution. They did not sneak in through the back alleys. They rode straight down the main street, two lone figures against a town holding its breath. At the edge of the square, the doctor's plan went into motion. A staged brawl erupted outside the saloon, a chaotic, swirling mass of flailing limbs and shouted curses that drew half of the judge's deputies away from the gallows. It was the opening they needed. Jedediah walked not to the sheriff's office, but directly to the hanging platform. He carried no rope. In his hand, he held the ledger. Judge Thorne, seeing his authority so brazenly challenged, bellowed for his men to seize them. But Jedediah was already speaking, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the stunned silence of the crowd. He read the names from the book, each one a ghost-given voice, a story of a missing daughter, a lost sister, a forgotten wife. The town's social proof, their shared belief in the judge's benevolence, shattered like glass. The crowd, armed with the truth, hesitated, no longer a mob, but a jury. In the ensuing gunfight, Jedediah was no longer a man of the law. He was the law, an essential protector shielding the innocent. But the final moral victory belonged to Elara. She walked toward the defeated judge, who cowered before her. She carried no weapon. She did not need one. She simply, deliberately, pulled aside the fabric of her dress, revealing the brand on her hip. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the crowd. It was his true sentence, delivered not by a court, but by the silent, undeniable testimony of his victim. In that moment, Jedediah felt a lifetime of guilt lift from his shoulders. He finally understood. Justice wasn't a code or a set of rules. It was a choice. The falling action was not a celebration, but a quiet, determined rebuilding. The judge's power structure, built on fear and lies, crumbled to dust. The blacksmith was freed, his hammer once again ringing with purpose. The town council, long a rubber stamp for the judge's will, was disbanded, and a new one elected, with Doc Miller at its head. The town began to heal. The final resonant image was not a kiss, but a promise. Months later, the long drought had broken. The landscape, once parched and barren, was showing the first tentative signs of new life. The town's well, which the judge had controlled and restricted, was once again full, its water clean and abundant. Jedediah and Elara, no longer sheriff and prisoner, but partners, stood by the well. They helped a small child draw a heavy bucket of water, the cool, clear liquid splashing over the rim, a powerful, life-giving symbol of the town's and their own new beginning. They had not just found justice, they had built a legacy.